technician developed, put together the chemicals, and that was the birth of DDT. Now, it was actually known before in 1874, I think, in a German lab somewhere, but this time it was made and put forth and developed as a very, very, very effective pesticide, this DDT, you see. So imagine, this is happening in 1936. What, is a prelude to some kind of thing? Well, there's so many ways to think about it. At the same time, Rachel Carson is beginning to write these books about the ocean, wherein the deep themes, as I've mentioned, of natural philosophy are the interrelationships between all these living things and their mutual ultimate kind of relationships in a world of unpredictability and yet cyclical. It can be understood in its cycles and its forms because these are formal things. This is nature, and everything in nature has a form, and yet the forms move and change, so that for us in our consciousness, which is formless in a way, something is gestated out of our fascination, which becomes works of language, art, you see. And this is what is happening. Be that as it may, the intellectual force and energy of humankind is put to other uses, of course, and they're juxtaposed with the work of Rachel Carson in such fascinating ways. So DDT was developed. It was a strong pesticide, and it worked so good. And unlike pyrethrum, if I'm pronouncing it right, which was derived from some kind of flower, it stayed, which was effective and is, it's the DDT stayed on surfaces for a much longer time and would continue to kill quickly for months after being applied, whereas pyrethrum would decompose in just a few days, and even the rains wouldn't affect it so much. You see this DDT. And how did it play into things? Well, gosh, this was the world and the culture out of which the atom bomb came, kind of like the ultimate, the splitting of the atom. Well, DDT isn't that so much, but it so effectively splits the life energy that it, and yet it has this use, especially for us, because we need to, well, it was so effective against, well, listen, it was humanitarian, for one thing. That's what did in the mosquitoes that carried malaria. DDT was what got rid of the body lice that carry typhus. DDT, not to mention all of this, bed bugs, soldiers in the jungle and the myriad stinging insects. Well, give them a dose of DDT, and you don't have to worry about that, and that it was given and used in great quantities at that time to soldiers alike, even after the war, you understand. How can you imagine how such a controversial thing, is this stuff harmful? Oh, yes. How is it used? It is used in these ways. Okay, what happens in nature when this is used? And that's where nobody's going to give you a straight answer, but Rachel Carson looked and saw with her visionary eye and could notate with a scientific accuracy what was happening, but more than all of that, was able to put it together into a prophetic utterance, you see, later on, involving DDT and the effect it had on the life chain and all of this. But I just want to say, though, I wanted to say that imagine the controversy of that, and it did arouse controversy. Rachel Carson became quite famous later on and quite controversial because she was speaking out against this poison thing called DDT, speaking out against that, speaking on behalf of this strange and invisible thing called the life cycle. What is that supposed to mean? What's this thing that you call the life cycle when, wait a minute, this is science. We can eradicate pests. This is, just like we split the atom, this is part of us and what makes us powerful. And yet in a book that you had to read and think about, you could maybe understand a different view. And this was being provided in beautiful form by Rachel Carson in her books, which became well known. She became famous because of her book called The Silent Spring, a book which really helped to explain this pesticide, but more than that, also expressed the ways, the meaning of this blight the meaning of these unforeseen consequences of what we have developed, which can still be used in many ways, but she brings up the necessity of regulation, of the use of this, because its use was being dictated by profit motives rather than the actual, what the environment could sustain. And there was an understanding of that could be understood by those who used it, but because of the way that they use it, of course, it's not understood, and so they resist these kind of ideas about this thing called the life cycle, and such things like unforeseen consequences, such things like interdependence of living forms and the changes that they go through, and especially such forms as, so what is our responsibility to that? What is our responsibility to that? I ask you, technology. What is our responsibility to that? I ask you, people in the democratic forum. Let me tell you about this, the dangers and the effects of this DDT. Let me tell you about the ways that we can mitigate its harms and come to understand it and continue on, because certainly it is all there for us, the good and the bad. It is given to us by this techne, by this gift we seem to have as people, as a people. And even so, when we look at it with a different kind of eye, we begin to see more. And this is also valid reasoning also. And so that becomes part of the story of Rachel Carson and what she did. But, oh yes, so what I wanted to say is that was controversial enough at that time. But now when you look at it, the way that the information in all of this, is understood now or not understood, you see the infinitely transient flickering of these ephemeral triggers to excitement and everything. And so can you imagine a controversy such as that between, of understanding the nature of a poison in relation to a complex and living environment? You've got to take a journey of understanding to understand all of these things. How could such a thing be undertaken nowadays with all the controversies that we are asked, to see and understand? Well, because also, I just think of it this way. I say to you that DDT can be understood from a humanitarian side in real specific ways. I just want to bring up this historical fact that I've recently learned, and it makes me think a lot about after Italy was freed, when the war was won in Italy and the fascists were driven away and gone, and the war was over, the refugees and everything, the peace, the vicissitudes and the trials of the peace ensued. And so the city of Naples was stuffed quickly full of refugees of all kinds, going all different places, nearby and farther away. And in wintertime and packed together close, which are ideal conditions, as the scientists noted, for a diphtheria epidemic. The scientists, in the employ of the governments and things, they studied the history and the disease vectors and all of this, and they understood, what was happening in Naples, that it was potentially a terrible typhus outbreak, and people were already dying at a high rate, and they were able to understand that it could so very easily get so much worse, and DDT saved the day. They had lots of it because they made it for the war effort. Now the war was over. Let's use it for the peace. We got lots of DDT. Let's dust the refugees. And they did. And that killed the body lice that carries DDT and, that carries typhus. And an epidemic was averted. And so, yes, so DDT saved the day. But then DDT was like dumped, on orchards and tracts of land in the United States after that. And there was the creature which we might remember in our history on the West Coast. I'm sure it's called by some different name now. It was called the gypsy moth. And on Long Island in the mid-1950s, I think it was, they had lots of DDT, of course, and it worked in Naples, so maybe it works on these pests. And so let's just dump it. We've got the planes to do it. We've got the propagation methods, and we've got the people who'll do the work. Let's do it, And so they did it. And they got rid of those moths all right. And they also got rid of, the ladybugs. All right. Oh, they got rid of most of the living crawling things. but not the aphids. And it was the ladybugs who ate the aphids. And so the aphids, just had their way with the land, and with the fruit, I should say, and the plants and the flowers, you see, and that was an issue. And they used it on a peach orchard, and the stuff, killed everything but these red spiders. So, as I understand it in my imagination, one could be treated to a sight of, an orchard full of peach trees. Only why are the peaches red? And why do the surfaces seem to pullulate with crawling red spiders that cover them like a carpet? Well, DDT did that because, yeah, it killed most of the animals. Well, if it killed most of, the crawling animals, if it killed most of them, why are they crawling all over the fruit in such a way that it's overwhelming to my understanding? Well, because I guess it works not in the way we thought. Well, let's just use it anyway, because after all, it's nature, and that it'll be better. But it's cyclical, right? Well, Rachel Carson would write books that explain the nature of these cycles, and what about them was vulnerable, and to that understanding, she was able to incorporate the real meaning of what was happening with this stuff called DDT. And, so now, this is, and we talk about it now, and there's still so much that we can understand of it. But I say this, she was a writer. So let's consider some of that. Yeah, she was a writer. And so both personal and vastly scientific. And I don't want to read all of these things, but there are certain passages and things that are so gorgeous and educational, and yet just interesting. Yes, like this. Is it this one? Ah, yes. Before I read you a little bit of her actual writing, I know we've come a long way to get to now, but I want to say that there's this paper written for her employer, Elmer Higgins, at the Bureau of Fisheries, which became this beautiful, not too long, 3-page or so essay, which became a publication, which then became a book, and so there's that. But then there's also, among all the kind of writings that she did, and she's talking in the common language and using, the letter, the magazine article. And she made many speeches after becoming famous and receiving all these honorary degrees. And she testified before Congress, of course. And she met with William O. Douglas, a great Supreme Court judge, who for me seems to have a troubling personal life, but certainly, had the understanding, that is so good. They worked together, right? And Rachel Carson and William O. Douglas worked together, and she worked with John F. Kennedy. She helped to, well, she brought her wisdom into the public sphere in these ways, and thank goodness it was even possible for her to do that. And let's hope it still is, after all, because it did happen in America, and it wasn't that long ago. And yet, also, anyway, so she wrote a memo to a coworker where she talked a little bit more in a more personal way about what she was writing about, and in so doing opens the door to really, a sense of her, her feeling self, And so I understand that she was a great friend. I mentioned Mary Scott Skinker. There's Mary Briggs. There's Dorothy Freeman. There are and so many others. And she corresponded with them all and traveled with them and went birding with them, and they were colleagues and they were correspondents. It's so rich in and of itself. But anyway, this memo is it's called Memo to Mrs. Eels, Mrs. Eales, not Eels, but Mrs. Eels, Memo to Mrs. Eels, which is a great piece of literature, where she just talks about her book. And I guess, it's so well done, That's what I want to say. The writing is so well done. I see all the ways that it comes across, teach me about the place out of which she was writing and her surroundings and the way that she was interpreting them. But this is one more thing about the book, that her first book, Under the Sea Wind, that I think is also very important poetically, and it's here. And here we go. We're going to read this. This is part of her. Here she is writing, explaining about this book, Under the Sea Wind, to Mrs. Eames, who's a coworker. I believe that most popular books about the ocean are written from the viewpoint of a human observer, usually a deep sea diver or sometimes a fisherman, and record his impressions and interpretations of what he saw. Okay, man, and yeah, you know what that makes me think of? That makes me think of the adventure stories that I read when I was a kid about scuba divers, and pirates and fishermen too. But anyway, so that's me saying that. But here's back to the text. I was determined to avoid this human bias as much as possible. The ocean is too big and vast, and its forces are too mighty to be much affected by human activity. Later on, she said, wait a minute, that's not true. At first, she really did say this, and she said it in so many words in her first book. The ocean is too big, and we can't really actually change anything about these vast and intricate cycles, which are so interconnected with each other and fragile in terms of their own world. But humankind, as such, cannot damage the ocean. Well, like I say, later on, before, and still is, that understanding still is sinking in. Well, she was saying, wait a minute, folks, wait a minute. I think I was wrong. I think that she noted that the polar ice caps were melting, for example. She noted, mainly in her, when she wrote about atomic waste, and she said atomic waste disposal is a thing that could permanently damage the whole thing. And here's how. But she always said, now there's always more research about this, and there's always more material to give us this understanding, but this is what I see now. And, yes. But anyway, so back to the text, though, because this is more of a literary thing and an imaginative and poetic thing I want to go into about her that I want to put in here. Anyway, so I was determined to avoid this human bias as much as possible. The ocean is too big and vast, and its forces are too mighty to be much affected by human activity, so I decided that the author, as a person or a human observer, should never enter the story, but that it should be told as a simple narrative of the lives of certain animals of the sea. As far as possible, I wanted my readers to feel that they were, for a time, actually living the lives of sea creatures. To bring this about, I had first, of course, to think myself into the role of an animal that lives in the sea. I had to forget a lot of human conceptions. Okay, that sounds good. Okay, yes it does. But now here she goes. She's going to tell us how she does this. For example, time, our understanding of time. Let's start with that. How do we let go of our human identity when we want to look at the world of these sea creatures who, like us, want to live? There is our common ground. We both want to live. Now, let's let go of our human conceptions and see if our imaginations, formless in and of themselves, can understand this different form. Okay, how will we do this? Well, let's look at our sense of time. Okay, so here she goes, I had first, of course, to think about, for example, time measured by the clock means nothing to a shorebird. His measure of time is not an hour. Talking about seeing eternity in an hour. His measure of time is not an hour, but the rise and fall of the tides, exposing his food supply or covering it again. Again, light and dark may mean merely the difference between the time when you are relatively safe, and the time when an enemy can find you easily. All these adjustments in my thinking had to be made, and in writing the book, I was successively a sandpaper. Sand? No. In writing the book, I was successively a sandpiper, a crab, a mackerel, an eel, and half a dozen other animals. Hardest of all, I had to get the feel of a world that was entirely water. So, thinking wise, I had to let go of my conception of time and understand a different kind of, like time, I guess, a different kind of rhythm, that of the tides and the way they cover or reveal the space where I can find my food, the way that I myself am covered or revealed to that which seeks me as food. You see, this is how, through a discerning meditation on the nature of time, directed for the purpose of this expressive use, Rachel Carson conveys to us a sense of what it's like for those who live in this environment, who want to live like we do in our environment, only they're living like they do in their environment. The medium is our imagination. You see, the medium is the imagination. The content of that medium, the vehicle of what furthers the understanding, which is what that medium seeks to live, is language, you see. And so here she is doing that. Yes. And but then it goes harder. Hardest of all, she says, I had to get the feel of a world that was entirely water. Let's not leave that part out. I had to get the feel of a world that was entirely water. Hardest of all. That means so much. That means, though, that in other of her writing, Rachel Carson talks about the sky as being a different atmosphere than the ocean. But the ocean is a different atmosphere from the sky, you see. And so this feeling of what it's like, this feel of a world that was entirely water, is not something that is abruptly come upon or let go of, because water is not abrupt in that way, you know. Well, water can be abrupt in other ways. Water can be so many things, right? But we have to get the feel of it to understand it. But then, okay, the living things, the particularities, the minute particulars, as William Blake called them, that live and want to live and do live and that feed on other lives and all of this stuff, which is being composed by the medium of the ocean, through the process of the light filtered down through the water into abysmal depths where certain microscopically multitudinous plants and animals, you know, you can hold up in the palm of your hand and see more of these little animals than there are stars in the Milky Way. And these are the plankton. And I learned from Rachel Carson that plankton means wanderers. I guess Greek etymologically, that's what she says. And I believe her. Plankton means wanderers. And there they are, converting the inert organic material, you know, into the calcium and the silica, etc., into this transformation that we still cannot understand, this alchemical thing, really, called photosynthesis, where light energy somehow catalyzes inorganic compounds, so that this further compound, which is not a compound, it's something else entirely, it's alive, and it must eat, and it gets eaten, so that other forms of life, you know, can go on from there, you see. Oh, but then, of course, yes, that's happening all the time, you see. All the manifestations are happening all the time. So much is going on. You know, so how does this searchlight, this spotlight consciousness, how does it like look at all of it? Well, what it does, it looks at the parts that reveal the whole, and then it looks at other parts and see how those parts are revealed to that whole. But then here we are back to the text again. She writes, I very soon realized that the central character of the book was the ocean itself. The smell of the sea's edge, the feeling of vast movements of water, the sound of waves, crept into every page, and over all was the ocean as the force dominating all its creatures. Right. And then she talks about the parts that she divided the books into. And then she talks in good stuff. It's good stuff about the animals that she became. The sanderling. She spoke through the character was a sanderling, which is a kind of sandpiper, and she observed them on the Outer Banks in North Carolina, and she understood, and yet understood the uncanniness, for example, their pattern of migration. These little sanderlings, running along the beach like little idiots back and forth, beep beep. You've seen them all. You've all seen them. You've seen them all. I don't think so, but you've all seen them. Well, yeah, maybe not until right now. But these sanderlings, they fly down from Tierra del Fuego all the way to the Arctic. And for a blessed time, they are before the conscious eye of Rachel Carson as she sees them. And so she becomes one, And when I say that she becomes one, well, of course, this is always happening in human consciousness, in one sense of, imaginative artistic power. And certainly that is the case with her. And yet she's very humbly and in common speech, showing us that this is how this is working. This is how this is working as a book. This is how I let go of my human conception of time. I understand the common feeling of wanting to be alive, the common feeling of relating to this moving, changing thing, this water, and we understand they are hungry, we are hungry. So there's so many ways and it's totally humble, that she does this. But anyway, she becomes a sanderling, a mackerel, haha, yes, in their whole cycle, in all these different places they go in the ocean. And she becomes an eel, and eels, let me see, let me just tell you what she writes about eels. Yes, this is really good. This is her, okay, she writes in her memo to Mrs. Eels, for the last section of the book, I had left the gently sloping sea bottom, from the tide lines out to the edge of the continental shelf and the deep Atlantic abyss. There was one fish whose migrations include all that varied undersea terrain. One fish whose migrations include all that varied undersea terrain. The eel. I know many people shudder at the sight of an eel. To me, and I believe to anyone who knows its story, to see an eel is something like meeting a person who has traveled to the most remote and wonderful places of the earth. In a flash, I see a vivid picture of the strange places that eel has been, places which I, being merely human, can never visit. Yes, an eel is something like meeting a person who has traveled to the most remote and wonderful places of the earth. In a flash, I see a vivid picture of the strange places that eel has been. Wow. Places which I, being merely human, can never visit. She says, I can never visit. I see, I meet this person, and there you are. And but okay, cool. That's Blakean. But here's some interesting facts, that are just simply interesting. Every eel that lives along our Atlantic coast began life in the distant Sargasso Sea. It lived at first so far below the surface that only the faintest blue haze ever penetrates there. For the most part, the water in which the baby eels are born is eternally dark and still and cold. The pressure is so great that it would instantly crush our unaccustomed bodies to nothing. All about the baby eels are the strange animals that live permanently in the abyss. Many of them carry their own lights, perhaps to help them see their way about in the darkness and find food. As the young eels grow, they work up toward the surface, and as they move up, the light becomes stronger. As they move up, the light becomes stronger. By this time, they look like tiny willow leaves, flat, oval, and transparent. In a few months' time, they begin their 1,000-mile journey toward the American coast. At first, probably they are carried along by the ocean currents. Later, they must swim independently. But here is the really remarkable part of the story. In the Sargasso, the young of eels from America mingle with the young of European eels. For the eels from all the European Atlantic coast make the long westward crossing to spawn in the Sargasso. But although many of the two species of young are intermingled during their first week or months of life, soon after the migration begins, the travelers separate. They form two great bands. One company proceeding westward toward America, the other eastward to Europe. The two kinds of eels are so similar that a scientist can distinguish them only by counting the number of vertebrae in the backbone. But the little eels themselves never make a mistake. They always return to the continent from which their parents came. So you see, all the eels on both sides of the world are born in the Sargasso Sea. And they're hardly different except for the number of vertebrae. We don't quite know, but they do. And we know that they do by the way they go, you see. And it's what's happening, you know. And so it goes on from there. Yes. So I just want to read a little bit more of that, and then we'll take a look and see where we are. Each of these stories seems to me not only to challenge the imagination, but also to give us a little better perspective on human problems. See, this is written probably in 1936 or so, you know. But, of course, the language is so simple and natural. That voice, we know as the voice, we know that voice. Obviously we do, as her friends do. I say obviously, perhaps I should say clearly in this way. Not that we know her as a person, but the gift of the consciousness is given in the form of this clear and enjoyably wrought and imaginative language that we can hold it in our minds. At least I can hold it in my mind long enough, you know, to really kind of get a feeling for it. So she says, each of these stories seems to me not only to challenge the imagination, but also to give us a little better perspective on human problems, those two sides, you know. They are stories of things that have been going on for countless thousands of years. They are as ageless as sun and rain, or as the sea itself. The relentless struggle for survival in the sea epitomizes the struggle of all earthly life, human and non-human. As one reviewer said, and she's quoting a reviewer. These are not her words, but here's how she closes this writing. As one reviewer said, our own battles for existence seem less a matter for dismay and more a simple reason for fortitude when compared in the mind with the ceaseless ebb and flow of life and death that are under all the sea winds. Under the sea winds. That's the title of her book there. She quotes someone. That's the title of her book. I wonder if it was a reviewer of her essay, but I want to read that quote just again. This is Rachel Carson quoting someone else, but this is the way that knowledge is shared by inspired minds, you know. Our own battles for existence seem less a matter of dismay and more a simple reason for fortitude, you know, less a matter of dismay and more a simple reason for fortitude, a simple reason for fortitude when compared in the mind, a simple reason for fortitude when compared in the mind, you know, which of course is the ultimate mystery. Rachel Carson, you know, she wrote so many things. I am sure. She later on, she adopted her her grandnephew, I mean to say. She had to. Um, I might have mentioned, you know, that she was a heroic supporter of her family through all these different times. But her family formatively was nurtured and fostered her strength, you know, in this world and inspiration and her way to do this. And so this network of lives, I say, was nourished in more than one way by her. And it was her friends who did so much, you know, along with her fame, of course, you know, but her friends that she had throughout her life were the ones who established, you know, the foundations and things and served, you know, without pay in order to gather together and keep and curate her writings to make it available to us now. It is because of her friends that I'm reading this, you see. A simple reason for fortitude when compared in the mind with the ceaseless ebb and flow of life and death that are under all the sea winds. So there's a little bit more that I would like to say. But, you know, at some point in the spiel, I have to see where we are in the talk, you know. And I'm at the point, you know, where I can just go on and on. So, and I can a little bit more. I want to go a little bit more about that. And along this very vein, a little bit, with her writing, too, continuing to bring that out. I would like to do that. But first, I want to read to you what is it like to come along with, what is it like to come along with some of the animals that she has given to us, you know, as characters. You know, one thing I want to say really quickly is, as a storyteller, one of the things that I like to say to myself and to others is, this is a story that comes from a time when the people were animals and the animals were people. You know, a time when the people were animals and the animals were people. This is, for me, a basic element of the palette, this kind of like playful understanding. Although I know the obstacle to human intelligence that is also we inherit, you know, in the forms of thought, you know, collective thought, you know, given to us in our language, where we are sometimes perhaps criticized for being anthropomorphic. That was one of the first kind of like critical terms that we probably learned when we were, you know, school kids. Anthropomorphic. Don't be anthropomorphic. You know, that's not scientific to be anthropomorphic. And yet here is Rachel Carson, such a great scientific mind. And could you say that she's being anthropomorphic? Well, yeah, you could, but what a shallow judgment. Well, I don't want to sound ad hominem about that when I say that. But what I do want to say, you know, about that is, we use the language, we don't use, well, the language is available to us as an expressive bridge, which in itself, as we understand it, feeds our understanding of what language is, and an expressive bridge. And what crosses that bridge is a certain, it's a mutual awareness, which is the basis of compassion, which is the understanding that other things want to live like us, you see. And that is that space of common understanding. They want to live like us. If that is anthropomorphic to see that, I would say, well, I'm going to set aside that is something that somebody would say about what's happening here. I set that aside. Yes, I accept a note. Yes, it could be called anthropomorphic, but how about it's actually an imaginative understanding of this common and feeling of wanting to be alive, which is one way to understand the basis of compassion. So I want to just read about just a little bit. Oh, there's so many things. Just this part. I mentioned the sanderling, its migration patterns. I mentioned the way that Rachel Carson conveys this animal consciousness. Here's an observation on the consciousness of a shad, a kind of fish, fascinating fish. The younger shad, um, these are shads migrating up the river to spawn from the ocean around Chesapeake Bay. The younger shad, by the younger shad, the river was only dimly remembered. He had been there before. That feeling of having been there before. For the shad, we're not going to describe the shad's deja vu, but we're going to say the shad was only dimly remembered, if by the word memory, Rachel Carson writes, if by the word memory we may call the heightened response of the senses as the delicate gills and the sensitive lateral lines perceived, the lessening saltiness of the water, and the changing rhythms and vibrations of the inshore waters. So this is how she enters into the consciousness of a shad, by speaking of its memory. And its memory is an awareness through its lateral lines of the degree of saltiness of the water. So it's a certain kind of element that is registering in the perceptive apparatus of the shad that is giving to us a feeling for its memory. It knows it has been here before because its senses have kept some memory of that. I'm not sure. And then, of course, she also mentions instinct and the nature of that. But anyway, so that's just an example of the kind of consciousness that I'm talking about. Well, I'll just read one more little thing then, and then we can. It will be a good way to give us something to walk away with and think about. It is this. It is. It's the closing of her book called The Edge of the Sea. And it is sort of like benedictory. I'm having to come to it, yes. So this is the end of the book, the closing word in the book, called At the Edge of the Sea, The Edge of the Sea. Now I hear the sea sounds about me. The night high tide is rising, swirling with a confused rush of waters against the rocks below my study window. Fog has come into the bay from the open sea, and it lies over water and over the land's edge, seeping back into the spruces and stealing softly among the juniper and the bayberry, the restive waters. The cold, wet breath of the fog are of a world in which man is an uneasy trespasser. He punctuates the night with the complaining groan and grunt of a foghorn, sensing the power and menace of the sea. Of all these shores, I'm going to have to skip some paragraphs. Of all these shores, there are echoes of past and future, of the flow of time, obliterating yet containing all that has gone before, of the sea's eternal rhythms, the tides, the beat of surf, the pressing rivers of the currents, shaping, changing, dominating, of the stream of life, flowing as inexorably as any ocean current from past to unknown future. For as the shore configuration changes, in the flow of time, the pattern of life changes, never static, never quite the same from year to year. Whenever the sea builds a new coast, waves of living creatures surge against it, seeking a foothold, establishing their colonies. And so we come to perceive life, as a force as tangible as any of the physical realities of the sea, a force strong and purposeful, as incapable of being crushed or diverted from its ends as the rising tide. Contemplating the teeming life of the shore, we have an uneasy sense of the communication of some universal truth that lies just beyond our grasp. What is the message signaled by the hordes of diatoms, flashing their microscopic lights in the night sea? What truth is expressed by the legions of the barnacles, whitening the rocks with their habitations, each small creature within finding the necessities of its existence in the sweep of the surf? And what is the meaning of so tiny a being as the transparent wisp of protoplasm that is a sea lace existing for some reason inscrutable to us, a reason that demands its presence by the trillion amid the rocks and weeds of the shore? The meaning haunts and ever eludes us, and in its very pursuit, we approach the ultimate mystery of life itself. So this is the vision of Rachel Carson in that sense. And this is the ethic of Rachel Carson. I'll just put it this way, just a quick note now. The ethic of Rachel Carson is the ethic. Okay, I'm saying the moral aspects of our responsibility, our awareness, and our sensitivity to all these life cycles, and our presence in a culture and society that has at its foundations ways to honor and cherish and protect the relationship to life so that all the things living therein can go on and flourish, right? That compassion in action is the ethic that Rachel Carson is so exemplary of, expressed in literary form. So here's the thing I love really quick. She won a $1,000 prize from Outdoor Life magazine in 1946 when she wrote, I guess they were looking for someone to do this. They said, we need a pledge. We need an embodiment of our ethic. We at Outdoor Life magazine, you know. I wonder what that magazine is like now. I know that at one time, you know, nature magazines and hunting magazines, they didn't have to be on opposite sides of something, and it wasn't like the outdoors people. It was oftentimes in these magazines there was a whole lot about conservation and what the government was doing to protect, you know, this habitat, which who has interest in it as well, you know, the human hunters also, like they also are interested in the way that the life in these places in nature is sustained. At one time, it was like, oh yeah, of course, why would that be controversial? Well, we've come a long way since then, haven't we? But I hope that we continue to go a long way out of that. And anyway, here is Rachel Carson, and here is what she wrote to Outdoor Life, and it's called The Conservation Pledge. I pledge myself to preserve and protect America's fertile soils, her mighty forests and rivers, her wildlife and minerals, for on these her greatness was established and her strength depends. I pledge myself to preserve and protect America's fertile soils, her mighty forests and rivers, her wildlife and minerals, for on these her greatness was established and her strength depends. So the scan is like the Pledge of Allegiance in many ways, is it not? To protect the fertile soils, you know, so that the life forms upon it may grow and flourish. Well, another great poet has written language that reminds me of it in many ways in this pledge. This is the poet Gary Snyder, and he wrote in one of his poems, I pledge allegiance to the soil of Turtle Island. Now, Rachel Carson said, I pledge allegiance to the fertile soil of America, I believe it was. Gary Snyder writes, I pledge allegiance to the soil of Turtle Island, and that's a mythical conception of the same place as Rachel Carson is talking about. Gary Snyder writes, I pledge allegiance to the soil of Turtle Island and to the beings who thereon dwell. One ecosystem, in diversity, under the sun, with joyful interpenetration for all. And I pledge allegiance to reading comprehension and to the republic of watchful listening for which it stands. One lit candle, dripping many waxy layers, overcoming the darkness, superior to any curse, so there. So these are our pledges, these are our connections, these are our ethical feelings expressed in beautiful literary language, inspired by Rachel Carson's writings, whom we are swimming in as if they were an ocean of love and intelligence, and they certainly are, and everything else too. So on that note, I bid thee, bon voyage and sweet dreams and deep understandings. May the waves bring them to you as you learn how to enter into the world of the writings of Rachel Carson, one of the greatest. And so here's to that. And so I thank you for your heroic listening and say to you, so long for now.